start, I want to thank you all for being here today. The crowd is not quite what I thought it would be, but you know, in light of the panic circumstances that surround us, I guess I'm not too surprised. But here we are, and I thank you. This is, first of all, a Civic Engagement Institute-sponsored event. Many of you know what the Civic Engagement Institute is. Excellent. I like that. So we've tried to advertise the Institute as well as the certificate in civic engagement that you can obtain by getting 18 credits, culminating in an internship or an independent study. So if you're interested in learning more about it, please contact me. I have my business card somewhere, but I'm not quite sure where. But anyway, I'm in Office 52. My name is Rafael Fierro. For those of you who don't know me, come find me and we can talk more about that. So way back in the fall, we thought that it's not every day that the impeachment of a president happens. It's actually only happened 3 times in American history. So it would be something worth talking about and educating our students on. And so it took a while to get together, and we understood that by the time we put on this event that the impeachment trial will have ended and it was going to be past history, but who says we can't learn from the past? So what we're offering today is a retrospective view of impeachment. So what I was saying is that I'm just going to offer just a few very brief comments, and then I'm going to turn it over to the panelists. But we also have a special guest host. Maybe some of you are too young to know this, but Al Terzi has been an iconic figure in Connecticut broadcasting, on-air broadcasting for, I don't know, I think since 1968, you were telling me this morning. So you've been around for the longest time, and I grew up with him, and so I see him as, like, he lived with us for many, many years, and he was beamed into the households of Connecticut residents for decades, and we're very happy to have him teaching here this semester. He's teaching a course in American government, but he's also gracious enough at the last minute to be part of this. And so what he's going to do is kind of introduce the panelists, and they're going to give their 10-minute presentations, and they're 10 minutes each, and then Mr. Terzi will ask them questions, kind of go back and forth for a little bit, and then we'll turn it over to you with any questions and comments that you might have. So we want to make this as much of a discussion-oriented event as we could. So that's what we thought we'd do. Okay? So before we get started on that, this mic is not working evenly. Oh well. First of all, I wanted to talk the basics about impeachment, and of course it's in the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution, Article 2, Section 4 says, and I quote, "The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors." And even in the wake of the impeachment trial of President Trump, I'm sure lots of people heard about the other high crimes and misdemeanors part, but the full sentence I just read to you does indicate it's not just the president who can be impeached, it could be any public servant. And others have. Supreme Court justices have been impeached in the past. Only 3 presidents in American history have been impeached. Okay? The case of Andrew Johnson, who was impeached but not removed from office. And I think a lot of Americans see those two things as the same. The president is impeached, therefore he is automatically removed from office. Not the case. To be impeached simply means to bring formal charges against, right? And that job belongs to the House of Representatives. Once that is done, then it goes to a trial in the U.S. Senate. And it's the Senate that decides whether whatever action the president has committed is going to result in the removal of the president from his office. So it's a 2-step process. I just wanted to make sure everyone was clear on that, because I think a lot of Americans muddle those two things together. Okay, Andrew Johnson was impeached but not removed from office. I believe he fell 1 vote short of being removed from office. It was really close. The second impeachment of a president was Bill Clinton 130 years later in 1998. Those are far different circumstances, and I truly hope we don't really get into the details of that today. But he too was impeached, but not removed from office. There the vote was much less contested. It was pretty clear cut that he would not be removed. I should note also Richard Nixon in 1974 might have been impeached, except that he spared the nation and I suppose himself when he decided to resign in August of 1974. So he would have been probably the second and overall the fourth to be impeached, but that didn't happen. And so that brings us to President Trump, who was officially impeached on December 18th, 2019. And that's where I'm going to leave it. I just wanted to give you those basics before we get on with the panel. So I'll turn it over to Mr. Terzi.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fierro. Can everybody hear me? Okay? Okay, good. It's a pleasure to be here. I remember when I was first in broadcasting and moved into television, I did the weather. That was an easy job, $2 an hour, so good pay at that time. Anyway, it was a long time ago. This experience for me is sort of a midpoint. It's not a culmination of anything, but having an opportunity to teach for Dr. Fierro in American government and trying to enlighten the students about how this government of ours works. Everybody was keyed in on the impeachment process, and of course we've all been, until recently, worried about that. Now we're worried about a virus that's traveling the world and creating all kinds of havoc. But it's interesting when you talk about the impeachment process. We have a presidential historian at Princeton, Julian Zelizer, who says, and I'm going to quote here, "Trump now always becomes part of the conversation about misusing presidential power. Ukraine will be his Watergate. Ukraine will be his Lewinsky." How about that? The president took the impeachment, though, more as a personal attack and an attempt to delegitimize his presidency than a judgment on his conduct. Kellyanne Conway, senior counselor for the president, this recently rejected the notion that he believes his legacy is going to be tarnished by this impeachment. And she said he sees it rather as a stain on the legacy of the people who have been so focused and hell-bent on removing him from office. And with that, let's get the conversation going about the impact of this impeachment on all of us. And you know, people who were with the president before are still with him and will always be with him, and people who were against him will always be against him, and then whoever's left is somewhere in the middle. Not happy about it, but let's move on, kind of thing. I want to introduce our panelists here, both of them, Bob Brown and Andrei Blazinski, and I'd like to have them each make some comments about their respective views of the impact of this impeachment on all of us, and where we go from here. What happens to the impeachment process? You know, the framers didn't say what high crimes and misdemeanors were. It was up to the Senate in the trial to decide that they weren't what the House said. And of course, you got the House was of the president, was not of the president's party. The House was the opposite party, and the Senate was largely of the president's party, and it was easy to predict the outcome. First, let's start with Andrei. Andrei, of course, now he's the economic expert, and he's going to, I'm sure, bring the economy into this discussion somewhat. But I want to know what your initial observations are about the impact of impeachment on all of us.
Well, I mean, I have a little prepared statement. Did I read that, or?
You can read anything you want to read.
Okay, good.
Anything you want to read.
Let me get that off my chest then. You did step on my punchline. That's okay. Oh, okay. Not a problem. Let me first clarify my political prejudices and predispositions. In 2016, I was a never Trumper, and but also an ABC. anybody but Clinton voter. So I voted for Gary Johnson. I'm convinced Trump is the most ignorant president in modern history. He seems to know virtually nothing about economics, even less about foreign relations, world history, and most importantly, American history, law, governance, and culture. I've watched in horror at some of the mistakes that resulted from this ignorance. To name just a few: withdrawal from Syria, following the example set by his predecessor, and likewise inviting the Russians to take over from us as the chief power broker in the Middle East. Trashing all our trade agreements in pursuit of a misguided goal of balanced trade, especially scuttling the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which would have given us an overwhelmingly superior bargaining power in dealing with the one trade relationship that does require fixing, that with China. The TPP encompassed 40% of world trade, its rules favored our policy goals, and the Chinese were on the outside begging to get in. Instead, Trump made sure that we faced China pretty much all alone. And by the way, we would have been much better placed in getting China to rein in its North Korean client. Another mistake was his decision to back out of the deal struck in Congress on immigration that would have given him the border wall, strengthened border security, and resolved the DACA issue. All because the Freedom Caucus wanted to reduce legal immigration. His rhetoric on specific immigrant groups I find abhorrent and racist. Talking about shithole countries on one hand and then following up with wanting more immigrants from Norway does seem to communicate a racial bias. Though I'm sure that he does not think of himself as a racist. But again, he's too ignorant of American culture and history to comprehend the perceived meaning of what comes out of his mouth. Trump says he wants to reorient immigration policy towards people who can make greater our economy. But he doesn't realize that his nasty rhetoric drives the best people away. Our economy has always benefited greatly from immigrants coming here to start new industries, but now many of the world's great innovators are choosing to settle and start their businesses in other countries. This is not entirely Trump's fault, but his anti-immigrant rhetoric is a major factor. Of course, he does have talent as an entertainer. And yes, he has an uncanny knack for figuring out what his audience wants to hear and captivating a crowd. He also does have some instincts that sometimes lead him to enact the right policies. I'm sure you will disagree with me on this, but his pushing back on the burgeoning avalanche of environmental and healthcare regulation, even more importantly, the uncertainty of the regulations slated to be written, was equivalent to at least $500 billion economic stimulus. It is what gave the economy its huge boost at the beginning of his presidency. The tax cut targeted to business and especially investment was also good economic policy. I'm very satisfied with his judicial nominations, and I believe activist judges are antithetical to a constitutional republic. And I hope that the Trump appointees to the Supreme Court will end the policy of deferring to and starting to rein in the administrative state. I am very pleased with Trump's rebuilding of the military, though I think he should listen more to his generals on how to fight wars, when to advance and when to retreat. His ignorance of military and political strategy is again on full display in this arena. I could go on my listing of Trumpian policies I oppose or support, but that's not the topic of today's program. So let's talk about impeachment. Trump has been accused of all manner of corruption, from being an agent of a foreign power to using the presidency to accumulate riches for himself, not to mention the alleged depravities in his life before the presidency. But putting aside the more outlandish and foolish accusations, I think the most central and instructive charges are two. One, obstruction of justice, and two, abuse of power. The second one by supposedly pressuring the Ukrainian president to dig up dirt on a political opponent. The first was investigated by Mueller, and the second was the subject of the impeachment trial. Now, if these charges were to be tried in a criminal court, I can't see how the case could have been made for guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. At most, you could get a hung jury, assuming the jury included at least a couple of Republicans. And yet, most Democrats are sincerely convinced of his guilt just as vehemently as most Republicans are skeptical about the case. Pundits tend to chalk up this divergence in politics to politics and partisanship. But I sense a deeper divide. And politicians may be underestimating the strength of conviction of the two opposing sides. Republicans seem to be surprised, genuinely surprised, by the intensity of animosity of Democrats towards Trump and how much they wish to see him in jail. Democrats also can't imagine how anyone could doubt Trump's guilt and seem oblivious to the anger the impeachment process engendered among even anti-Trump Republicans, including myself. Of course, impeachment is not a criminal trial, and beyond a reasonable doubt is not the standard. Impeachment is a political process, a process that requires a standard of what is an impeachable offense, and then once that is established, the Senate, sitting as a jury, has to determine guilt. Democrats were very happy to quote the supposed constitutional scholar Jerry Ford, saying that an impeachable offense is anything Congress decides. Other scholars, perhaps better qualified, dismiss this definition. I don't intend to try to resolve the issue here, but while I don't believe the obstruction of Congress as described in the second article of impeachment meets this criterion, or any criterion, I will stipulate that obstruction of justice, that was not included in the articles of impeachment, and abuse of power as described in the second article of, I guess it's the first article of impeachment, both qualify as impeachable offenses. So the remaining questions are, what standard of proof can be used to determine guilt or innocence, and is he actually guilty on that standard? What has to be considered here is what is at stake. It isn't just the future of the president. The impeachment sets a conflict between two key pillars of a Republican form of government. One, popular sovereignty, meaning democratic elections where people, not politicians, decide who will govern. And two, the rule of law, so that no one is above the law, especially not elected leaders. Impeachable offenses involve violations of the broadly understood rule of law. But the judgment of guilt implies removal from office, and a judgment that the transgression is serious enough to justify suspending popular sovereignty and overturning an election. The standard to take such a step must be rather high. Thus, it is about high crimes and misdemeanors, not just any crimes. And don't be fooled that misdemeanors means minor transgressions. It is meant to be open-ended, but not whatever Congress deems. In short, the crime has to severely damage the republic and or cause others significant harm. The Democrats claim that, of course, obstruction of justice and abuse of power strike at the very foundation of the rule of law. And the specific instance of Trump, for his personal political advantage, pressuring Ukrainians to dig up dirt on the Bidens, inflicted harm on our Ukrainian ally and American national interest. I agree that these transactions and harm could be serious enough to justify removing a president from office. But the obstruction of justice and the abuse of power did the obstruction of justice and abuse of power actually occur? And was harm actually done? It seems this depends on what one is willing to believe about the man himself. Democrats hate Trump and are quick to conclude that he is the epitome of all evil, and thus he must be guilty of the most vile crimes based on his presumed vile nature. The guilt is written on his face. Republicans say not so fast. What are the facts? It is clear that Trump has said to his aides he wanted to fire Mueller and half a dozen others who were investigating him. But that would be in fact obstruction of justice. But with the exception of Comey, whom he fired directly and quite justifiably, he did not bother to follow up and make sure people are actually fired. As for the abuse of power case, all evidence is indirect. It does seem that he may have told some of his aides that he wanted to get to the bottom of the Biden story, and maybe even hold up aid to Ukraine for the purpose. But ultimately, he did not get what he allegedly wanted. Ukraine and American national interest was not harmed, and available evidence is not dispositive. And there are alternative explanations for his interest in the Biden case, even though Democrats dismiss these out of hand. For that matter, an alternative explanation for all of Trump's offending utterances may be simply his ignorance of American history, government law, and political culture. He mouths these things, these stupidities, out of ignorance. He seems not to understand that he is giving his political enemies ammunition. At best, the evidence may show intent, but intent without the act is not a crime. and it does not inflict harm. The Mueller investigation was not halted or derailed. According to Mueller himself, Trump did not impede the investigation and actually cooperated. And again, no real harm involved in the Ukrainian abuse of power case. This brings me to the case of, brings to mind the case of Henry II of England, who famously asked, "Will no one rid me of this meddlesome priest?" referring to Thomas Becket. In that instance, Henry's underlings took his rhetorical question to be a command and proceeded to murder the cardinal. But was Henry guilty of murder? In fact, more importantly, more to the point, would he be guilty of anything if his men did not follow up, did not do the evil deed? That's kind of what we're talking about here. Finally, as much as I dislike Trump's style, rhetoric, mannerisms, and persona, I believe the real threat to our constitutional form of government is from the manner in which the Democrats have started impeachment talk before his inauguration and how they conducted the actual impeachment process. They have set the evidentiary bar for impeachment way too low and invite retaliatory impeachment of Democratic presidents in the future. I just hope Republicans can act a bit more responsibly and refrain from such action. The irony is that the impeachment process has helped me overcome my revulsion to Trump and causing me to even consider voting for him. Because an important political and historical lesson needs to be taught here so that we don't have similar impeachment processes in the future. So I think if Trump does get reelected, to some extent it'll be Mr. Schiff and Mr. Nadler that will have been responsible. Thank you.
Before I turn it over to Bob, I want to ask you if you think the voters will, in November, do what the Senate did not do,
Vote him out of
leave office.
This is not working.
Okay, well, maybe we can share one, okay? You wanna take it? Yeah.
I believe that Donald Trump is going to win another term as president. I do. That doesn't fill my heart with joy. But I think that that's what's going to happen. I think that the Democrats, in many ways, misplayed their hand, and Trump has a solid base of support. And part of my talk is going to be who he's going to be running against and the implications of that. Yeah, he's not running against a strong field either. So.
All we hear is that the economy is the greatest and unemployment is the lowest ever. What do you think is going to hold sway in election day?
That's a good one, because right now the economy is kind of,
Well, yeah,
sideways.
Independent cause, yeah.
Yeah, but if one can presume that the economy will bounce back if the coronavirus thing is, because hopefully the warm weather is going to reduce its threat. And if the oil problem is resolved some way, which right now it's a new one, then indeed the economy is going to bounce back. And yes, indeed, it will be a positive factor towards electing Trump. And I do think he's going to get reelected the way that things look now. I may be wrong, but maybe. Bob, you want to say?
Bob? That's fine. I can talk about what I had.
Okay, so why don't you?
Is that okay? Well, I teach history. Okay, so I'm going to try to rush through 4 impeachment incidents, and I use that term deliberately, in American history in a matter of 10 to 12 minutes, which means 3 minutes apiece, roughly. Okay. The history of presidential impeachment in the United States begins in 1868, when the President of the United States, Andrew Johnson, was subjected to impeachment proceedings by the House of Representatives, which voted to remove him from office for breaking a law. That sort of, I think, sets up the first point that I would like to make, which is, with only one exception, I think it can be made, the argument can be made that the process of impeachment has been, in American history, at least as resolved under English presidents, inherently political. Johnson's was clearly a political impeachment. Johnson, through a series of odd twists and turns related to the Civil War, ended up running for Vice President of the United States with a Republican president, Abraham Lincoln. Johnson himself was Democrat from the South. And the Republicans reached out to him in an attempt to broaden the appeal of his party, their candidate. The candidate that Lincoln actually ran under the label of the Union Party. When President Lincoln was assassinated, Johnson rose to be president, and it became clear very quickly that he had an agenda that was quite different from that of a faction in Congress, the radical Republicans, wanted to push aggressively the issue of extending opportunities to African Americans in the South to former slaves. And Johnson, a Southern Democrat himself, stood in the way of that agenda. And so they decided they were going to get him out of office. Johnson was unfit to be president. Johnson was arrogant. Johnson was boastful. Johnson was vain. Johnson liked to be sucked up to. If he sounds like somebody who's perhaps president of the United States now, well, okay, that's not necessarily coincidental. He was also, and I think this is something that not related to Trump's feet, Johnson was also an alcoholic. And Johnson was perfectly willing to carry out a series of policies that were racist, because he was a racist. He was a Southern Democrat after all. And to stand in the way of the radical Republicans' attempt to push through aggressive civil rights legislation. And so they decided to get him. And what they did is they passed a law that, knowing their man, they knew he would break. The law basically made it illegal for the President of the United States to fire any member of his cabinet without the approval of Congress. They knew what Johnson was going to do. This was like waving a red flag in front of a bull. He was going to fire somebody. And he did. And their response was, aha, he broke the law. That's surely a high crime. And impeachment proceedings were initiated. The House of Representatives voted to impeach President Johnson and sent the case to the Senate, where the attempt to remove him from office fell one vote short of him being removed. So clearly a political motivation for a political trial. And you know, my historical instincts all lie on the side of the radical Republicans, but yeah, they politicized the process. The second presidential incident, impeachment incident, I use that term deliberately, involves President Nixon. Nixon was not impeached. He resigned before impeachment, as Dr. Fierro said. The backstory there is what is, I think, profoundly interesting. First of all, Nixon's campaign in 1972, not Nixon himself, his campaign in 1972 found itself awash in money. Millions of dollars. Those of you who are taking journalism with me, you start the semester by watching All the President's Men, and the story of Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward, a very good movie. It details the story fairly well. They had so much money that what they decided to do with it was to use it to sort of skew the election, to decide who Richard Nixon would run against. Their specific goal was to defeat the candidacy of the Democratic frontrunner, former vice presidential candidate in 1968, Edmund Muskie of Maine, and with the nomination of what they perceived as the weakest candidate, Senator George McGovern from South Dakota. I can also tell you that George McGovern, the first presidential election I could vote in, and he was the first presidential candidate I voted for, and he went down to the most flaming defeat that any presidential candidate has done. Project succeeded. Now what happened is, as part of their attempt to undermine the Democrats, they had all this money to spend, and they spent it on things that were illegal. And one of the things they spent it on was the burglary at the Watergate Hotel in June 1972 of the Democratic National Headquarters. They were caught. The burglars were. And so what you end up with is a 2-year process that leads to Nixon's resignation. The myth of Watergate is that enterprising journalists dug deep and found the story. The real story of Watergate is President Nixon taped his conversations. So there was a record of what he had said at one time or another. And the whole story of the last 18 months of Nixon's presidency is the attempt by a special prosecutor to get those tapes released so they could be read, just transcribed to see what Nixon had actually said. No one has yet demonstrated, to my satisfaction, I think to most people's, that Nixon actually knew what was happening around him. But the day after, 2 days after the burglary at the Watergate Hotel, when his chief of staff, two chiefs of staff, had a meeting with him, they told him, listen, this is what happened. They broke in the committee to re-elect the president, funded the break-in. What do we do? And Nixon's basic order to them was obstruct justice, cover it up. And that is why the House moved to impeach him and sent articles of impeachment over to the Senate, and before they could actually arrive, President Nixon resigned. I would argue that's not a political act. I would argue that because there was such a, there were Republicans who voted to impeach President Nixon. There were Republicans in the United States Senate who were willing to vote to remove him from office. They just didn't have to. This was a process decided on the merits, and it ended up with a good result. Nixon said in an interview he gave well after he was out of the presidency, said something else that I think Donald Trump would echo. If the president does it, it's not against the law. And that's a rather stark statement. Now, that doesn't say that the president's not responsible for what he did while he was president afterwards. And that's why when President Ford, his successor, pardoned Richard Nixon, he did so with reference to many crimes that might have been committed by the president. Bill Clinton, you got to touch on Monica Lewinsky, you can't help it. But the thing about Clinton's impeachment is, yeah, boy, if there was ever political impeachment, it was this one. They started looking for something, the Republicans started looking for something on Clinton from the moment he was elected. And the first thing they came up with and got a special prosecutor appointed was an investigation into a land deal that went bad in Arkansas when Clinton was governor, in Whitewater Corporation. And they tried to prove that the Clintons, Bill and Hillary, had shaken down the federal government to cut through a very long, complicated historical argument. It turned out that's not the case, that didn't happen. But by the time these special prosecutors' work was underway, it led to other places, and other places, and other places, and it ended up with Monica Lewinsky. And the offense that Clinton ultimately stood charged with was not that he had lied to the American people, but that he had actually, in a court of law, an Arkansas court of law, sworn that he had not, in a deposition, sworn that he had not had sexual relations with any of a number of women, one of whom was Monica Lewinsky. And so they started out over here and they ended up over here, and clearly a political impeachment. As is Trump's. I can remember going to parties between the time that Trump was elected and the time he was inaugurated, and listening to people saying, well, how can we get him out of office? And they were dead serious. I said, it's not easy to do. The president's got to do something wrong. I think that it has to be something really specific and precise. I knew that I was going to end up disagreeing with Andre about something, because we always do. And life would not be the same if we didn't. But what happened in the case of Trump, I think, since this is, we'll go over the details since it's fairly fresh in everybody's mind, is that Trump actually did what the people around Nixon did. Trump wanted to run against the weakest candidate, get rid of the strongest candidate he could possibly run against, Joe Biden. At least that's how he assessed the evidence at that time. Now, Nixon had a whole campaign staff doing that without Nixon knowing that that's what they were doing. Trump just cut through the middleman. He went to the president of Ukraine and said, hey, fix it for me. I want you to look into this guy, find out bad stuff, and if you find it out, then you'll get your aid. Now, you can quibble around the details of that whether the case was that ball was made to President Zelensky of Ukraine. But that was clearly what was at work here. Was it obstruction of justice? No. Was it obstruction of Congress? No. Was it abuse of power? I would say yes. And for the record, just to finish up, of the last three most recent impeachment incidents, Nixon Clinton and Trump, I would have voted to impeach in all three cases, and I would have voted to remove them from office. Because I think that yes, we do have an attempt to use the power of the office to skew in the favor of political advantage in the case of Nixon's people, and certainly obstruction of justice in Nixon's case, and in Trump's case. Bill Clinton swore an oath in court, and then broke it. And if that's not a high crime or misdemeanor, I don't know what is. As for Andrew Johnson, the person I like least among these four, and that includes even Donald Trump, I would probably have not voted to remove him from office because this was clearly a trumped up political, a matter of politics trumped up by the Republicans to achieve a political objective. And I think that the evidence doesn't support his impeachment. Though he certainly should have been out of town on the rail. So that's me. Thank you.
Bob, I wonder, this is for both of you, if the president should win re-election in November, what impact will that have on the institution of impeachment?
Well, one of the things I said is that in fact an important historical lesson needs to be taught, and I think that would be it. I think next time whatever people want to impeach a president primarily for political reasons, they will pay the price because they will pay the price. I think that's going to happen.
I hope that we take a break from impeachment. I truly do. I hope that we stop playing political gotcha and look for ways to disagree with civility. And if that's the outcome of the last 50 years of American history, then that's probably a good thing because it seems we've got less and less and less civil. I would hope that we would take impeachment more seriously than we seem to have in the past 2 generations. I'm not sure that that's going to happen, but I would hope that would be the case. And that's notwithstanding the fact that I said in each case I would vote to remove the person from office because I do think that they committed something that I would regard as a high crime. I just think that we need to take a deep breath and step back and stop disliking each other so much. So.
How did we get to this extreme polarity that we have in the political realm? How did we get so bad?
Oh gosh, I think part of it is the tenor of the times. We as Americans don't trust each other. I was listening to the Colin McEnroe show week before last, I think, and he had the whole show was devoted to secession movements, places where people want to leave the United States, or leave one state and become part of another one. And I think that speaks to a larger mistrust among us. I think that we are deeply polarized. I also think that it's impossible to ignore the fact that social media and our increasing polarization, anybody can go online and say anything. I think that the power of the instruments of new media like Facebook leads to, I would say disinformation, but somebody once told me disinformation is just lies. That leads to attempts to present stuff that's not true and make it true. And if somebody says something loud enough and long enough, people believe it. But I think that's not necessarily a cause, it's a symptom. We're divided because we disagree about a lot of stuff.
Well, it seems to me that actually the time in history when things were as bad as they are today, if not worse. So go back to the election, Jefferson and Adams,
Or to 1860.
Right, and because the new media then was the newspaper, right?
Yeah.
Today, so it is to some extent, I think, a function of media. I mean, today, if you think about it, okay, if anybody wants to want the president, has to have a screw somewhere, because who wants to be exposed to that kind of goes through an examination or that kind of just all your laundry out. I mean, normal people just would recoil from that kind of stuff. So you got to be nuts to do this. And that's the people we select, people who are indeed somehow, how should I put it, you know?
It's because we have a populist president in office, and people are just picking up on that vibe.
Well, I think it's populism is on the rise across the world, actually.
Yeah.
And it is also, I think, a sign of the times, and it is very disturbing. Okay. And how should I think it is also, it's the fault of all the politicians, actually. I mean, from both parties, the rhetoric has been populist for years. I mean, the business about trade agreements. Okay. I mean, I'm an economist. I'm sorry. The trade agreements are generally a very good thing for the economy. Okay. And yet people are, saying all kinds of things that are totally untrue about these agreements. And NAFTA was a dirty word, nonsense. And in fact, increased employment, it increased wages, it did everything positive, okay? There's a few people that in fact did lose, but that's normally the case with any progress. Okay? So the point is that I think, in fact, the reason Trump got elected is because of this populism that was spread not so much by the Republicans, but especially by the Democrats. So the Democrats elected him. And now, of course, we've got what? Bernie, right? I mean, it's the same issue. He's a populist. To me, Bernie and Trump are kind of two very similar. Okay? I'm sure you have.
No, I think that Andre is on something there. I absolutely agree that Sanders is. I'm sorry, not very often, but sometimes. Trump and Sanders are sort of doppelgangers. They're like faces in a mirror. They appeal to the same groups. Essentially, they prey on discontent. And the only difference is if you look in a mirror and you hold your right hand up, the mirror is holding his left hand up. So that's what they are. They appeal to the same set of grievances, and it would be nice to have someone who didn't appeal to grievances.
That's actually one reason why Trump is going to get reelected. Bernie is going to lose. The candidate will be Biden, and some of the Bernie supporters are going to vote for Trump, as they did last election.
William Howell, he's a University of Chicago political scientist, one of the leading scholars on the power of the American presidency, and he has a lot to say about this particular president and the idea that in political polarization, the increase in the money in politics, or is it the seeds of dysfunction just going all the way to the Constitution, he's asking. Could the solution come by actually giving the president even more power? Because he says this book he had written reflects upon the capacity of government to solve problems and suggests that it doesn't do a particularly good job.
Well, I don't think the president's power should be expanded. That's for sure. Because then the problem is, depends who you elect. If you elect we actually got lucky with Trump, because to me he's not an evil genius, he's an idiot. But we could have elected an evil genius. And the problem is that if you give more power to the presidency, that's going to not be a very happy moment. So I would say no. In terms of
well, I was going to say Raphael, and I think you were there too, Andre, and I participated in panel discussions on the relative power of the presidency versus Congress. And I think that clearly now, with Congress divided, we're in a position where the president does, to a certain extent, because he's in charge of a unit, and the other unit is divided, he does stand supreme. I'm not sure it leads to greater functionality, but I do think that our government was built not to work. Okay, that's its purpose. Its purpose is, and if you the debate over the creation of the Constitution, the whole notion of balance of powers is predicated on the assumption that things are supposed to be hard. They're supposed to be slow. They're not supposed to be easy. We don't rush into anything. because we're human beings and we could be wrong. And that's why, even within the Congress, the Senate has powers that are checked by the House of Representatives, so they have different functions. And certainly, the president can't, well, increasingly the president can do more than the president could do in the past, or chose to do in the past. But the president can't do everything. I sort of like our fumbling around. I really do. I think that it's not necessary to be uniformly efficient in all things, because efficiency is great as long as it leads to a good result. But if it doesn't, then you've done far more harm than you have done good. I sort of like the status quo. I just wish we could stop fighting each other all the time so fiercely.
I would agree with that, but you know what? There's something else. It seems that there is a problem that we do need to address, because Congress has been increasingly for a long time delegating legislative powers to the administrative branch, to the and I think this is going awry. And on top of that, Congress, the presumption is that Congress then can do oversight, but Congress really is incapable of doing oversight for all kinds of reasons, including partisanship. Okay, so the question is, that problem seems to be getting worse, and it's heading in the wrong direction, and that is something that we need to address. Now, one possible way is to, in fact, maybe create some additional power in the judicial branch to, some kind of body that can, in fact, you can appeal, or some kind of way of appealing decisions of administrative bodies, where, in fact, it does not involve necessarily the politicians, but some additional mechanism where we can challenge decisions of the administrative state, of the administration, and even of Congress, where these things can be indeed adjudicated in court. That's my only solution that I have. But it's a problem.
Yeah, I think that right now we're stuck. The nation is, at least the politically active portion of the nation, is polarized, and I don't see any easy way out of that. I think we're going to be polarized for a while now. Trump was a surprise, and a surprise that did skew the nature of politics dynamically, and not just because Trump articulates a particular worldview, but because Trump evokes powerful emotions on both sides, love and hate, to an extent that I'm not even sure Bill Clinton did, though goodness knows the Republicans hated Bill Clinton.
Can I just interject here for a second? Because I want to extend what was said. In some ways, Trump was a surprise, but in other ways, not at all. Because, for me, Trump was the logical culmination of many, many years and decades of congressional inability to act against the president, like Andre said. And what was startling to me about the impeachment trial, I think the Democrats did what they had to do. This was a check against executive overreach, right? But where had the Democrats been during the Obama years when there was executive overreach? Or where were the Republicans during the Bush years when there was executive overreach? Where was Congress when Harry Truman decided he's going to call the Korean War a police action rather than actually get a declaration of war from Congress? Where was Congress during Vietnam? So it's not at all a surprise that a president, someone like Trump with his personality, would come along and then decide he can do whatever the heck he wants. And then we're all shocked about it. If you know history at all, you realize that it's just a logical continuation of what happened.
I would say this too, to sort of take that analysis in a slightly different direction. Trump is a culmination. Trump is a culmination of an election process that began in 1988 with the race between George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis. It was the most aggressively, overtly racist campaign by a Republican that anyone had ever run. The linchpin of it was Michael Dukakis' week on crime. Why? Because he let somebody out of prison in Massachusetts and went to Maryland and killed a couple people. Well, first of all, yeah, he did that, and that's bad enough, and the guy should be tried, executed, convicted, or sent to prison for life, based on your opinion of the death penalty. But Dukakis didn't release him. The judicial system of the state of Massachusetts, the released him. And released him under legislation passed by a Republican, signed by a Republican governor. And you know, the Willie Horton ads were infamous. But I will say this, it let something out of the closet. I said at the time, I had a friend at the time who was a Republican party chairman in Central Connecticut, one of the towns in Central Connecticut. And I said to him, you've got to be careful. You can't control this. And he said, oh yeah, we can. And 20 years later, they couldn't.
I'd like to just go back a little in time. I think I would go back to the Bork nomination, or when it began.
Well, I want to ask you about the president when he was running for office. He talked about draining the swamp. Is there evidence he's done that?
It's yeah, it depends on, Andre's right. No, it depends on how you define swamp.
It doesn't matter to voters.
Yeah, and then I think that he certainly creates the impression that he has. Has he, well, and you know, the language around draining the swamp has morphed into deeper, more theoretically frightening language like undo the deep state, which I think is probably a sophisticated description of the swamp. I would say he hasn't done that. He hasn't gotten a lot of people out of power who are entrenched in the bureaucracy in Washington. What he's done is he's shrunk the bureaucracy. He's done that. And then the other thing he's done is he's placed his own people who have their own swampiness, if you will, in positions of limited authority. He's no one is, very few people are actually serving as secretary or chief of staff or undersecretary, serving as the Ken Cuccinelli, the person who's in charge of immigration, is not undersecretary for this particular thing. He is, he has his title, and then the rest of it is serving in the capacity of this position. He has put in his own people, and he's managed to do it without, well, by substantially bypassing Congress. So he's changed the swamp. I'm not sure draining it is exactly what it is.
You have a question? Oh. Somebody have a question out there in the audience?
Comment or question. Don't you think?
Why don't you come forward a little bit? I think that wherever the speakers are, you're getting feedback. That's what's happening. Or go backwards.
Don't you think people should be careful if he nominates them or selects them for jobs? Because think of all the number of people whose careers, or Lot Kelly, Jeff Sessions. There's a train of them whose lives have been just.
Should
really...
he drain the wrong swamp?
I'm just saying that there were so many people. In fact, the most recent said, no, I don't want to be chosen for the job you're looking for me to do, because so many people's careers already. The other question, the other thing I wonder about, and I know we've talked about it before, is the Electoral College. And Trump really wasn't elected by the popular vote.
Right.
And shouldn't we be looking at both the Electoral College and trying to get that changed on ballots across the country, and also looking at the voting district issue, which was taken over, and people have these incredibly strange, and it's been questioned in the courts. I mean, voting district should be a geographical area where you happen to live, and when you start setting it up so that you've got this Republican group and you set up this voting district that looks like a dragon or whatever, who knows? I mean, it's a controlling thing, and certainly the people with the power, the Koch brothers, whoever is behind all of this power and money, have done some amazing things to really co-opt the power of the people.
I would say a couple things. One is I'm not sure I want to feel sorry for the people that are accepted at the positions in the Trump administration. I mean, it's sort of like Icarus. I mean, it's exposed to the sunlight, you get burned. I mean, most people should realize that. And by the way, it's not just Trump, it's any president gets the same problems, okay? As far as the gerrymandering thing, okay? Yeah, I'm sorry to burst your bubble, but it wasn't the Republicans that started doing it. I remember way back in the 60s, this was the popular thing because then you had most state legislatures in Democratic hands. And this was a serious problem. And those weird districts, I remember seeing them in the papers, okay, and it was Democrats who created. So all that's happened is that the leadership, I mean, the party, you know, the parties in power in the states have changed. It's the same practice, and yes, it's not a good thing. Okay, we shouldn't do that.
This was a function of the Republican gerrymandering, which is what we're dealing with right now, is actually a function of a mistaken judgment by the Democratic Party, beginning with President Obama. The Democratic Party made a decision in the first decade and the second decade of the 21st century to focus on presidential power and power at the national level. Meanwhile, state governments were electing Republican legislatures, and Republican legislatures redrew the districts because the Democrats weren't paying that much attention. And my favorite, Andre is sometimes right, frequently right, I will say. I like to play over his agreements, but that's because it's fun. My favorite district attempted to gerrymander that failed was one in North Carolina, which basically was designed to create a Democratic district when the Democrats were in control, designed to create a Democratic district. And basically, you have to demonstrate that there is some reason to link these population groupings. And this one was basically a city in central North Carolina, another city sort of further south in North Carolina, separated by about 50 miles and linked by an interstate highway. And their argument was the interstate highway is the connector. Well, of course it is a connector, but you don't do it that way. And the Democrats tried it too. So.
Now, the story of gerrymandering, some of you may know this, about the way a district line was drawn in Massachusetts. It reminded some writer in a Boston newspaper of a salamander. So, Jerry and Mander, that's how that phrase was coined. And we're going through another process very shortly because we're having a census this year to redraw the district lines. Connecticut, I think, based on probably not an accurate analysis, but it looks like it's going to be very close whether we keep the 5 districts we have. The population goes down, and we don't. You need 700,000 or so people for every district, and the population where we are right now is pretty close. But well, here we are. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, go ahead.
I think, well, at least in my perception, public distrust of the press and the news media has reached a peak as of recently. I'm not entirely sure if that's true, but to me it seems like it's coincided with the rise of Trump. Do you think that would be something that he's touched upon, sort of a social undercurrent that he's tapped into, or do you think it's something that he's nurtured? I would say that he has encouraged it, but
well, he certainly has benefited a lot from it. Mm-hmm. And no other president that I know of has benefited to this degree. And he's got the Fox News channel out there every day. Of course, the Democrats have MSNBC and to some degree CNN as well. But this was one big change in the media that I've noticed over my years, that it's okay to say something favorable about a presidential policy or even to promote it.
Again, I think the distrust of media predated Trump. I think he more than distrust of media to help him get elected. And yes, he of course does promote that further. Although I don't think he likes Fox anymore. So that's another thing. I'm not he. No, but Trump.
Oh, Trump.
Yeah, because sometimes they criticize him there too.
It depends on what day of the week it is. I would say that the other factor, looking at the media, and we're going to be grappling with this in journalism later in the semester, you have this remarkable segmentation. There's so many, I mean, the term media, for much of my life, and for almost all of my career in journalism, basically consisted of 3 television stations, 3 networks. And yeah, you had local newspapers, and they were kind of fun and interesting and quirky, but the dominant newspapers was the New York Times, and to a lesser extent the Washington Post, the Boston Globe, and the Los Angeles Times. The journal was important in a segment, but we're talking about sort of mass subscriptions, and now you can get any news you want anywhere you want, and it's not vetted. What we've done is we've lost, and certainly there are many people out there who are happy about this, but we've lost the role of the media as gatekeeper. The media is the people who decide what belongs on the national agenda. And now anybody can pitch any old idea into the pot and see what happens. So I think that you've gotten, there is no monolithic media anymore.
Yeah, I'm happy that in fact the media isn't the gatekeeper. On the other hand, people are beginning to rely more and more on social media, and there is a serious problem with that. Because the problem is that the algorithms are set up that whatever you like to find out, whatever point of view you want, they'll feed you more of it. As a result, you wind up getting hooked up to this umbilical cord that feeds you constantly the same point of view, and you wind up being a moron. You wind up not being able to understand the goddamn thing because you're buying whatever the story is.
Well, you said
mainlining it.
You said many times in panels that the best advice you could give to anyone, student, among others, is to make sure to read publications you disagree with.
Right. By the way, I've given up on the New York Times, but I do watch BBC.
Well, I want to make a point. When I said before I love Fox, I do love Fox 61. I would never say that I love the Fox News Channel, not because I don't like them. I would just never say it because my judgment about anything is not anybody's business. I don't bring my judgment into any of the decisions I make on the news. And we have editors I work with who I'm happy to say keep the same policy when they decide which stories we're going to cover on a daily basis. Maybe not on a daily basis, but on a particular day. And they make a good journalistic decision about the importance and the need for the people to hear about this story. And I've always been proud of being part of that. I predate by many, many years this new phenomenon of having an edge one way or the other. But I think people still think the media, even though we try, they still think, number one, that we're part of the Fox News Channel, which is a different operation entirely. We are a Fox Network affiliate. So we do what we want to do and what we think is appropriate journalistically. And so we've, I think, been very successful at that, or I wouldn't be part of it.
And
I would
Al,
never be part of anything like that.
Al, you touched on something that sort of interests me too. And that is the conviction. And I think that you're right when you're describing the way a basic, well-run news organization operates. But the conviction out there among many people, I think just about everybody, that somehow or other everything that goes into a broadcast or goes into a newspaper is there because somebody had an angle. Somebody had a vested interest. Somebody wanted it that way. And basically, that there's a conspiracy to shape the news.
Right.
I used to tell people who call up and made that accusation against the paper that I was editor of, hey, come on down and watch us for a day. I wish we had time to plan a conspiracy. That would be really nice, but we're too busy putting the paper on.
That's right.
We have one more question.
One more?
So how do you think the 2020 election would look like with Bernie Sanders as the ticket and supported by the DNC?
repeat of the Nixon-McGovern election.
Yeah.
A landslide for Trump.
I think so. I think so too. And I say that even though I voted in the Democratic primary in 2016, I voted for Sanders because 4 more years of Clinton was just 4 more years too much. I had no conviction that he was going to win the nomination. He came closer than I thought. The campaign's already begun against Sanders. He's a socialist. He's a communist. And then he feeds into it. He says nice things about Cuba. And, he says nice things about authoritarian governments. By the time the election comes around, he's not going to be Bernie Sanders. He's going to be Red Bernie. And I think that's the way that election will play out, unfortunately.
But young people just love him. The millennials, they're all over everything he says. And why is that? Why is
Because
this
the
so
Soviet Union
entrenched?
is no more, That's why. I realized that was going to happen. Once the Soviet Union disappeared, we wouldn't have the prime example of what a socialist country is. And thus, young people don't know the history and don't know about that stuff.
Yes.
Well, I have a question. So the two of you both believe that Trump is going to win this election. And yet for him to be impeached, if he does get impeached, I think this is going to be a Twitter that no one will ever forget, him saying, I got impeached and I got reelected again. But I think a lot has to do with the American people thinking, as Andre had said, is it better to have an ignorant person versus an evil person in the office? And I think what the American people are thinking is, okay, so maybe he was trying to get his campaign. Is that evil versus someone that really has other methods? Was it that bad?
On a personal level, I find it nauseating. But I think again, we're lucky because we could have elected a genius. And the way people are listening, the thing that really disturbs me about the last election and current times as well, is that the electorate is scary. The electorate is capable of electing almost anybody, and as I said, so far we're lucky. Next time we may not be so lucky. And the problem, I think, it goes deeper because it seems to me that we've stopped teaching, at school civics. People get frustrated about the fact that, you elect a Republican Congress, and guess what? They can't do anything. That's why they voted for Trump, because he said, I'm going to get it done, The problem is that the system is set up on purpose that way, and people should understand that it's supposed to work that way. It isn't supposed to be easy, okay? And so, again, the problem is that, once again, the electorate is, this populist way is dangerous, and it comes from ignorance of our society, of our political culture, of our political institutions, and that's what's really scaring me. Not Trump.
A couple of points. First of all, by his own admission, Trump is not an evil genius. He is a very stable genius. Second of all, I think that events like today and institutions like the Civic Engagement Institute are really good backstops to sort of restoring a tone of decency, civility in politics. The sense that, no, just because I disagree with you doesn't mean that you're scum. It doesn't mean that I have to hate you. It means that I disagree with you. And that's a plug for the institute.
Probably ended there, but we do have one more question. Before we leave today, I'd like to ask this question.
Is the switch on?
Talk about. George, talk about.
Yeah, just stand up and talk.
Yeah.
What did you say the biggest problem are issues, politics, that are now parties that once used to represent the American people, now they are so big to be majority of people, or you guys said they're polarizing their ideas, but they're not reflecting their views, and they're picking up issues sides. Should there be limitations to their powers?
I don't know. I will say this. It used to be that both political parties attempted to appeal to as broad a base as they thought that they comfortably could. And that is to say, there used to be things called creatures called liberal Republicans. And there used to be creatures called conservative Democrats. Now there are very few liberal Republicans, and there are very few conservative Democrats. The parties have become a symptom of the nation. And I'm not sure what we can do about that. I know that Raphael's lovely spouse wants to see a third party emerge. Yeah, she talks about that a lot. And boy, that'd be great. There are just too many structural impediments in American politics to doing it.
Seems that the time would be right for a third-party movement, and I'm kind of surprised that it hasn't gelled in any real significant way. Some might even argue that Trump is in fact a third-party person in his own right, except he co-opted the Republican Party.
And corrupted.
And corrupted. Listen, we're out of time. I really want to thank you all for being here. I want to thank both Professor Brown and Professor Gibbons.